I never thought my marriage would end over a vacation house, but there I was. Standing in our marble-floored entryway in Maplewood Heights, still wearing my yoga pants and an old college sweatshirt, watching my husband of 12 years pack his leather duffel bag like he was heading to another one of his business conferences. Except this time, Marcus wasn't coming back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through our floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors we'd spent months choosing together. The same floors where our 8-year-old son Caleb had taken his first steps, where we'd built countless Lego castles, where just last Christmas we'd all sat opening presents like we were the picture-perfect family everyone thought we were. Marcus moved with the same methodical precision he used in his law firm's boardroom, shirts folded exactly in half, ties rolled and tucked into the side compartments, his Rolex collection carefully placed in their velvet-lined case. Every movement was calculated, cold, like he was executing a business transaction rather than dismantling 13 years of our lives together. I stood there frozen, my coffee growing cold in my trembling hands, trying to process what was happening. The fight had started 3 days earlier when I'd suggested we sell the lake house in Clearwater Springs. The one that had become his obsession, his weekend escape, his excuse to disappear from family life for days at a time. I'd simply asked if we could use that money for Caleb's therapy instead. He'd been struggling since starting 3rd grade, having panic attacks before school, begging me not to leave him at drop-off. But Marcus saw it differently. He saw my suggestion as an attack on his success, his status, his image as the successful attorney who owned prime lakefront property. "That house represents everything I've worked for," he'd said, his voice sharp and final. "It's my legacy." "What about your son?" I'd asked quietly. "Isn't he your legacy too?" That question had apparently been the final straw. Now, 3 days later, Marcus zipped up his bag with the same finality he used to close difficult cases. He turned to face me, his steel gray eyes devoid of any warmth I'd once thought I'd seen. There. His perfectly styled dark hair didn't have a strand out of place, his designer shirt wrinkle-free even though he'd just finished packing his entire life into 2 suitcases. "I'm keeping the lake house, obviously," he said, adjusting his platinum wedding ring one last time before sliding it off and placing it on the entryway table. "And the boat. The Porsche stays with me, too." I opened my mouth to speak, but he held up his hand, the same gesture he used to silence opposing counsel in depositions. "You get the kid," he said flatly, like he was dividing up office furniture. "Seems fair. You're the one who thinks he needs all that emotional hand-holding anyway." The words hit me like ice water. "You get the kid." Like Caleb was some unwanted item in a divorce settlement. Like our beautiful, sensitive, brilliant little boy was a burden being passed off to the parent foolish enough to care about his well-being. I felt the air leave my lungs entirely. This was the same man who'd cried when Caleb was born, who'd stayed up all night when he had the flu, who'd promised to be the father he'd never had. And now he was walking away, not just from me, but from his own child, like neither of us had ever mattered at all. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He's your son." He shrugged, shouldering his bag. "He's too soft, always crying, always scared of something. Maybe this is what he needs, to toughen up without me around to coddle him." That's when I heard her voice from the doorway. Patricia, Marcus's mother, stood there in her cream-colored Chanel suit and signature pearl necklace, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her surgically enhanced lips. She'd been staying with us for the past week, supposedly to help us work things out, but I now realized she'd been here for an entirely different purpose. "Well," Patricia said with a cold laugh, her voice dripping with disdain, "at least you'll finally have time to focus on what you're actually good at, playing house and making excuses." They both laughed. actually laughed, like the complete destruction of our family was some sort of inside joke they'd been planning all along. Like the 8 years I'd spent building a home, raising their grandchild, supporting Marcus's career while putting my own interior design business on hold. Like none of it had meant anything at all. I stood there, still clutching my coffee mug, feeling like I was drowning in my own living room. The house suddenly felt enormous and empty, even though nothing had been moved yet except Marcus's personal belongings. The family photos on the mantel seemed to mock me. All those smiling faces, all those vacations, all those birthday parties, where we'd played the role of the happy, successful family. But that's not the part I came here to tell you about. The part you need to hear is what happened 6 weeks later in Judge Richardson's courtroom in downtown Maplewood. That's when my son Caleb, my quiet, sensitive 8-year-old boy who'd been told his whole life that his feelings were too much, walked up to that witness stand, looked his father straight in the eye, and asked in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear, "Mom, should I read what Dad texted his girlfriend about me?" The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that polished marble floor. Marcus's high-powered attorney, the one who'd been so confident about getting shared custody, looked like she'd swallowed her tongue. Patricia, sitting in the front row wearing her courtroom pearls and practiced concerned grandmother expression, went completely pale. And Marcus, successful, controlling, always has the last word Marcus, just sat there staring at his 8-year-old son like he'd seen a ghost. Because in that moment, Caleb held something more powerful than any legal argument Marcus's expensive lawyers could make. He held the truth, and for the first time in his young life, the adults in that room had no choice but to listen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us! Now back to the story. I remember standing there in that entryway, frozen like a statue, while they laughed at my son's expense. But it wasn't just the laughter that cut through me like a knife. It was the calculated cruelty behind it. The way Patricia's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, like she'd been waiting years for this moment to finally put me in what she considered my rightful place. At least now Caleb might actually learn some resilience, Patricia continued, adjusting her pearl necklace with manicured fingers. All this therapy talk and emotional coddling, it's exactly what's wrong with children these days. In my generation, children learn to handle their problems without running to mommy every 5 minutes. Marcus nodded approvingly, like his mother had just delivered closing arguments in a winning case. She's right, Isabella. The boy needs structure, not endless feelings discussions. Maybe this separation will actually be good for him. The casual way they discussed my child, our child, like he was some failed project that needed fixing made my stomach turn. These were the same people who'd barely spent quality time with Caleb, who dismissed his artwork as messy, who rolled their eyes when he got excited about his rock collection or wanted to show them a new book he'd discovered. Patricia smoothed down her perfectly styled blonde hair and picked up her designer handbag from the side table. "I'll be staying at the Riverside Hotel downtown until Marcus gets settled in his new apartment," she announced, as if I'd asked for her itinerary. Someone needs to help him transition properly. This is such a difficult time for him. Difficult time for him, not for the 8-year-old boy who was about to have his world shattered, not for the wife who'd just been discarded like yesterday's newspaper. For Marcus, the man who was choosing a lake house over his own family. "You know," Patricia said, pausing at the front door and turning back to face me with that practiced smile she used at her charity luncheons. "I always told Marcus he was too generous, too forgiving. I said from the beginning that he needed someone who could match his ambition, someone who understood what it meant to be married to a successful man. The implication hung in the air like poison, that I wasn't good enough, that I'd somehow failed as a wife because I'd prioritized our child's emotional well-being over maintaining appearances, that wanting my husband to be present for his family was asking too much." Marcus said nothing to defend me. He just stood there, checking his Rolex like he had somewhere important to be. like the family he was abandoning was just another appointment that had run too long. "Where is Caleb?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Upstairs in his room," Marcus replied without looking up from his phone. "I told him I had to go away for work. Figured it was better to keep things simple for now." Simple. He'd reduced the destruction of our family to something simple. No explanation, no goodbye, no reassurance for a child who was already struggling with anxiety. Just an absent father disappearing with a lie. Patricia opened the heavy oak door, letting in the cool morning air. "Isabella, dear," she said with false sweetness. "I do hope you'll consider getting some help for yourself during this transition. There are wonderful support groups for women who struggle with these situations. I'm sure the church has some resources." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. She wasn't offering help. She was delivering a final insult, suggesting that I was the one who needed fixing, that the breakdown of my marriage was somehow my fault for not being strong enough, successful enough, silent enough. As they walked toward Marcus's black Porsche, I could hear Patricia's voice carrying across our circular driveway. "Really, Marcus? You should have done this years ago. That woman never appreciated what she had. And the way she babies that boy, it's no wonder he's so sensitive. Children need discipline, not endless emotional validation." Marcus loaded his bags into the trunk with the same efficiency he used for everything else in his life. No hesitation, no backward glances, no moment of doubt about what he was leaving behind. He'd made his choice, and it wasn't us. I watched through our living room window as he started the engine, the expensive car purring to life. Patricia settled into the passenger seat, probably already planning how to redecorate his new bachelor apartment, how to introduce him to appropriate women at her social functions, how to erase any trace of the family he'd just abandoned. They drove away. I noticed Mrs. Henderson from next door peeking through her curtains. The Johnsons across the street were getting their mail, but taking an unusually long time about it, clearly watching the drama unfold. In a neighborhood like Maplewood Heights, where appearances meant everything and everyone knew everyone's business, I knew the whispers would start immediately. Poor Isabella. Couldn't keep her successful husband happy. Too focused on that sensitive child of hers. No wonder Marcus left. She never understood what it meant to be married to someone important. The isolation hit me like a physical blow. In one morning, I'd lost not just my husband, but my entire social circle. My sense of belonging in this community I'd called home for 8 years. The other attorneys' wives, the country club friends, the neighbors who'd always been polite but never quite warm, they'd all side with Marcus. They always did. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The house felt impossibly large and quiet around me. Our housekeeper, Maria, wouldn't be in until tomorrow. The gardener, James, would continue maintaining our perfect landscape, probably wondering why there was suddenly only one car in the driveway. Everything looked exactly the same. The fresh flowers I'd arranged yesterday still bright in their crystal vases. Caleb's school artwork still proudly displayed on the refrigerator. The family photo from last summer's vacation to Aspen still smiling down from the mantel. But everything had changed irrevocably. That's when I heard the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs. Small feet, hesitant, careful not to make noise. Caleb appeared at the top of the staircase in his superhero pajamas, his dark hair sticking up in impossible directions, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant. "Mom?" he called softly. Why did Daddy take his suitcases for a work trip? And why? Was Grandma Patricia here so early? I looked up at my beautiful boy, at his innocent face full of confusion and trust, and I knew that everything I did from this moment forward would shape how he understood love, loyalty, and his own worth. Marcus and Patricia had made their choice about what mattered to them. Now it was time for me to make mine. I walked up those stairs to my son, each step feeling heavier than the last. Caleb was sitting on the top step now, his small legs dangling. Through the mahogany balusters, elephant clutched tight against his chest. His brown eyes, so much like mine, nothing like his father's cold gray ones, searched my face for answers I wasn't ready to give. Daddy's work trip is going to be a little longer than usual, I said, settling down beside him on the carpeted step. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but I needed time to figure out how to explain that his father had just walked away from us like we were a business deal gone bad. Caleb nodded solemnly, but I could see the wheels turning in his 8-year-old mind. He was too smart, too observant. He'd probably noticed that Marcus had taken his golf clubs, his expensive cologne collection, even the framed photo from his desk, things you don't pack for a typical business trip. "Can I make pancakes for breakfast?" he asked, changing the subject in that way children do when they sense the adults around them are drowning. "Of course, sweetheart." "Extra chocolate chips?" His face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen in days. "And whipped cream?" "Absolutely." We spent the morning in the kitchen, Caleb standing on his wooden step stool, carefully measuring flour, while I tried to push down the panic rising in my chest. The normalcy of it, the measuring cups, the sizzling butter, Caleb's serious concentration, as he flipped his first pancake, felt like a lifeline in the chaos. But I knew this peace wouldn't last. I knew that within hours, maybe minutes, Marcus would start making calls. To his lawyer, Richard Blackwood, the most ruthless family attorney in the state, to his accountant about protecting his assets, to his real estate agent about listing this house that Caleb and I called home. Marcus never did anything without a strategy, and I was naive to think he'd simply disappear and leave us alone. This was just the opening move in what would inevitably become a war. After breakfast, while Caleb settled into his usual Saturday morning routine of cartoons and Lego building, I made my own call. To Sarah Chen, the only attorney I knew personally. We'd met at a parent mixer at Caleb's school. Her daughter Emma was in Caleb's class, and we'd bonded over our kids' shared love of science experiments and chapter books. "Isabella?" Sarah's voice was warm but concerned when she answered. "How are you holding up?" Emma mentioned that Caleb seemed upset at school yesterday. Even my 8-year-old's teacher had noticed. The guilt hit me fresh. How had I let things get so bad that it was affecting Caleb at school? "Sarah, I need help," I said quietly, moving into my home office and closing the door. "Marcus left this morning. He wants a divorce, and I think he's going to fight me for custody." There was a pause. Sarah specialized in corporate law, not family cases, but I trusted her judgment more than anyone else I could think of calling. "Isabella, you need to call Rebecca Martinez immediately. She's the best family attorney in the Tri-County area. I'm texting you her number right now. But listen to me carefully. Start documenting everything. Every conversation, every text, every interaction with Marcus or his family. Everything." "But he just left a few hours ago." "Surely. Men like Marcus don't leave without a plan." Sarah interrupted gently. "I've seen this before in corporate divorces. He's probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months. You need to catch up fast." The words hit me like a slap. While I'd been worried about Caleb's anxiety, planning family dinners, trying to hold our marriage together, Marcus had been strategizing my destruction. I spent the rest of the day in a strange, surreal bubble. Caleb and I worked on a 1,000-piece puzzle of the solar system. We took our golden retriever, Sunny, for a long walk around Willowbrook Park. We ordered pizza and watched a movie, curled up together on our oversized sectional sofa. To anyone watching, we looked like a mother and son enjoying a peaceful Saturday. But underneath, I was frantically trying to remember every detail of the past few months. Every time Marcus had taken mysterious phone calls in his study. Every time Patricia had made comments about Isabella's little anxiety project when referring to Caleb's therapy. Every time Marcus had brushed off family events to spend weekends at the lake house. That night, after Caleb finally fell asleep in his own bed, a small victory, since he'd been sleeping in my room for weeks. I sat in Marcus's abandoned home office staring at his empty desk. He'd cleared out everything personal, but he'd left behind the desktop computer we'd both used for household finances. Maybe he'd forgotten about it, or maybe he was so confident in his legal strategy that he didn't think it mattered. I turned it on, hands shaking slightly, and began scrolling through emails, bank statements, credit card records. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus had been planning this for at least 3 months. There were emails to Blackwood dating back to February, discussing asset protection strategies and custody considerations for high-net-worth divorces. There were records of money being moved into accounts I'd never heard of. There was even a detailed report from a private investigator about my daily routines, my friendships, my fitness as a primary caregiver. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in his deleted messages folder. Texts between Marcus and someone named Victoria Langston. Messages that made it clear this wasn't just about the lake house or my suggestion about Caleb's therapy. This was about Marcus starting over with someone new, someone who fit better into his image of success. "Can't wait to be done with all this family drama," one message read. "Isabella and her constant worrying about the kid is exhausting. Victoria gets it. She understands what it means to be with an ambitious man." Another, "Caleb will be fine with weekend visits. Kids are resilient. Besides, Isabella has been coddling him since birth. Maybe some time apart will toughen him up." I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. This man, who had held Caleb as a newborn and sworn to protect him forever, was discussing our son like he was an inconvenience to be managed. But as devastating as those messages were, they weren't the ones that would change everything. Those messages, the ones that would eventually make an entire courtroom go silent, I wouldn't discover until much later. And when I did, when Caleb accidentally saw them too, they would give us something Marcus never expected us to have: the truth, and the courage to speak it. Because here's what Marcus didn't know about his quiet, sensitive son. Caleb had been watching, listening, remembering everything. While Marcus thought he was being clever, covering his tracks, building his perfect exit strategy, his 8-year-old boy was forming his own understanding of what was really happening. And when the time came, when we were standing in that courtroom 6 weeks later with Judge Richardson looking down at us from his bench, Caleb would be ready to tell everyone exactly what kind of father Marcus really was. Not because I coached him, too. Not because I turned him against his dad. But because sometimes the truth has a way of demanding to be heard, especially when it comes from someone too young to lie about what they've seen. That Saturday night, sitting in Marcus's abandoned office, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I made a promise to myself and to my sleeping son upstairs. Whatever happened next, whatever legal battles we had to face, Caleb would never doubt that he was loved, wanted, and worth fighting for, even if his own father had already decided he wasn't. To understand how we got to that moment in Judge Richardson's courtroom, you need to know how Marcus and I began. Because it wasn't always cold calculation and cruel dismissals. Once upon a time, Marcus Thornfield was the most charming man I'd ever met. I was 25, working as a junior interior designer at Blackstone and Associates in downtown Riverside. Fresh out of design school, drowning in student loans, living in a tiny studio apartment above Mrs. Kim's Korean restaurant. I was ambitious, hopeful, and completely unprepared for someone like Marcus. He walked into our showroom on a rainy Thursday, in October, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying himself like he owned every room he entered. He was looking for someone to redesign his newly purchased penthouse in Harbor District, a corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. "I need someone with vision," he told my boss, Mr. Blackstone, but his eyes kept finding mine across the room. Someone who understands that a space should reflect success, not just comfort. I should have paid attention to that phrase. Success, not comfort. It was Marcus in a nutshell, though I didn't realize it then. When Mr. Blackstone assigned me to the project, I was thrilled. This was my chance to prove myself, to work with unlimited budget and complete creative freedom. Marcus was 10 years, older, already a partner at Wellington, Crane and Associates, specializing in corporate acquisitions. He had everything I thought I wanted: confidence, financial security, and a way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in any room. Our first design meeting lasted 4 hours. We discussed everything from Italian marble to his collection of first edition law books to his plans for entertaining clients. He listened to my ideas with intense focus, asked thoughtful questions, and by the end of the evening, I was completely captivated. "You see possibilities where others see problems," he said as we stood on his empty balcony, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the water. "I like that about you, Isabella." The way he said my name, like it was something precious he was discovering for the first time, made my heart skip. When he asked me to dinner the following week, I said yes without hesitation. For 6 months, dating Marcus felt like living in a fairy tale. He took me to restaurants I'd only read about in magazines. We attended gallery openings, symphony performances, charity galas where I met judges and city council members and business leaders who shaped our city's future. He bought me my first designer dress, my first pair of real pearls, my first taste of what life could be like with unlimited resources. More importantly, he seemed to genuinely care about my dreams. He encouraged me to start my own design firm, even helped me secure my first independent clients through his professional network. When I worried about taking such a big risk, he'd wrap his arms around me and say, "Isabella, you're going to be brilliant. I believe in you completely." The proposal came on New Year's Eve at the stroke of midnight in front of all his friends and colleagues at the Harbor Club's annual gala. He got down on one knee right there on the dance floor with a 3-carat diamond ring that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above us. Everyone applauded. Cameras flashed. It was everything a young woman dreams her engagement should be. We married 8 months later in a ceremony that made the society pages of the Riverside Tribune. Patricia had insisted on St. Augustine Cathedral, the most prestigious venue in the city. 200 guests, a 7-course dinner, a 12-piece orchestra. I felt like Cinderella, especially when Marcus whispered in my ear during our first dance, "Mrs. Thornfield, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." The first 2 years of marriage were wonderful. We traveled to Europe for our honeymoon, 3 weeks in Italy, France, and Switzerland. I established my design firm, Bella Interiors, in a charming historic building downtown. Marcus was making partner, working long hours but coming home with stories and ambitions that made me feel like we were building an empire together. When I got pregnant with Caleb, Marcus was over the moon. He immediately started planning the Fianciki nursery, talking about boarding schools and Ivy League educations, buying tiny Harvard onesies that made me laugh. "This child is going to have every advantage we can give him," he promised, his hand resting on my growing belly. But somewhere, during my pregnancy, things began to shift. Subtle changes that I dismissed as normal stress from his growing responsibilities at the firm. Marcus became more particular about our social appearances, more critical of my choices. When I suggested we skip a client dinner because I was exhausted, he'd get that tight expression around his eyes. "Image matters, Isabella," he'd say. "People are watching us now more than ever. We need to present a united front." After Caleb was born, the changes became more pronounced. Marcus loved showing off his beautiful baby son at social events, but he had no patience for the day-to-day reality of parenting. When Caleb cried at night, Marcus would move to the guest room. When Caleb got sick and I had to cancel dinner plans, Marcus would go alone and make jokes about daddy daycare duty. "All babies cry," he'd say when I worried about Caleb's colic. "You're being too anxious. He needs to learn to self-soothe." I started noticing how different Marcus was behind closed doors versus in public. At parties, he was the doting father, the supportive husband. At home, he was increasingly distant, impatient, critical. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd dismiss my concerns. "You're being too sensitive, Isabella. This is what real life looks like. Not everything can be perfect all the time." Patricia's influence became more obvious, too. She'd make comments about my parenting choices, my decision to breastfeed for a full year, my overprotective responses to Caleb's needs. "Boys need to be tough," she'd say. "All this attachment parenting nonsense will make him weak." When Caleb was 3 and started showing signs of anxiety, fear of loud noises, difficulty separating from me, bedtime struggles, I wanted to consult a child psychologist. Marcus refused. "There's nothing wrong with him that a little structure won't fix," he said. "Patricia raised 3 boys without any of this therapy talk." That's when I realized the man I'd married and the man I was living with were 2 different people. The charming, supportive Marcus who'd encouraged my dreams had been replaced by someone who saw vulnerability as weakness, emotion as inconvenience, and family life as something to be managed rather than cherished. But I kept trying. I told myself it was the stress of his work, the pressure of providing for us, the adjustment to fatherhood. I made excuses for his impatience, his criticism, his increasing emotional distance. I convinced myself that if I could just be better, a more perfect wife, a less anxious mother, a more successful businesswoman, things would go back to how they used to be. I was wrong. Because the Marcus I'd fallen in love with had never really existed. He'd been a performance, carefully crafted to win what he wanted. And once he had it, the beautiful wife, the perfect child, the picture of success, he no longer needed to maintain the act. By the time Caleb turned 8, I was walking on eggshells in my own home. Every decision was scrutinized, every concern dismissed, every expression of need met with irritation. I'd become smaller and smaller, trying to take up less space, 'cause fewer problems demand less attention, but I wasn't the only one watching. Caleb was too. And what he saw would eventually give him the strength to speak a truth that would shatter Marcus's carefully constructed facade forever. Monday morning arrived like a freight train. I'd barely finished my second cup of coffee when the doorbell rang at exactly 8:47 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw a man in a navy suit holding an official-looking envelope. "Isabella Thornfield?" he asked when I opened the door. "Yes, you've been served." The papers felt heavier than they should have in my hands. Petition for dissolution of marriage, immediate temporary custody hearing, asset protection order. The legal language blurred together, but the message was crystal clear. Marcus wasn't just leaving, he was declaring war. I called Rebecca Martinez immediately. Her secretary, Angela, somehow squeezed me into her schedule for that afternoon. Rebecca's office was in the Meridian building downtown, all glass and steel with a view of the courthouse where our battles would soon unfold. "He's moving fast," Rebecca said, scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. She was in her mid-40s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made you understand why Sarah had recommended her. "The temporary custody hearing is scheduled for Friday. That gives us 4 days to prepare." 4 days? My voice cracked. Is that normal? For someone with Marcus's resources and connections? Unfortunately, yes. Richard Blackwood specializes in aggressive tactics. They're hoping to catch you off guard, make you seem unprepared or unstable. I thought about Caleb, who was currently at school, blissfully unaware that strangers in suits were deciding his future. "What do they want?" Rebecca flipped through the pages. 50-50 custody to start, but I suspect that's just their opening position. They're painting you as an overprotective mother who's hindering Caleb's development. They've requested a court-appointed child psychologist to evaluate his emotional state. The irony was suffocating. For years, I'd begged Marcus to let me get Caleb proper support for his anxiety. Now, suddenly, Marcus was concerned about his emotional well-being. The next 3 days became a crash course in legal warfare. Rebecca's team worked around the clock, gathering evidence, interviewing character witnesses, preparing our defense. My friend Sarah connected me with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a child psychologist who specialized in custody evaluations. The good news, Dr. Rodriguez explained during our Wednesday consultation, is that Caleb's anxiety patterns are well documented through his school counselor. The records show you've been proactive about getting him support, while Marcus has been largely absent from those conversations. But Marcus's team wasn't sitting idle. On Tuesday, a woman in a rental car parked outside Willowbrook Elementary during pickup time, taking photos with a telephoto lens. When I confronted her, she claimed to be documenting custodial fitness and stability. Wednesday brought a surprise visit from Child Protective Services. A caseworker named Jennifer Mills arrived with a clipboard and apologetic smile, explaining that they'd received an anonymous report about concerning home conditions affecting a minor child. "I'm sorry," she said as she walked through our house, making notes about everything from our stocked refrigerator to Caleb's clean bedroom. "These calls are usually nothing, but we have to investigate every report." I knew exactly who had made that call. Patricia had always criticized my housekeeping, my parenting choices, my lax approach to discipline. Now she was weaponizing social services against me. Thursday afternoon, Marcus showed up at Caleb's school unannounced. He'd never attended a school event in 8 years, but suddenly he was there for the third-grade science fair, playing the devoted father role to perfection. I arrived to find him chatting with Caleb's teacher, Mrs. Foster, while Caleb stood beside him looking uncomfortable and confused. "Isabella!" Marcus called out cheerfully when he saw me, like we were still a happy family. "I was just telling Mrs. Foster about our family situation. I wanted to make sure she knows I'm committed to being present for Caleb during this difficult transition." Mrs. Foster, who'd taught for 30 years and had seen every kind of family drama, gave me a meaningful look. She'd been the one documenting Caleb's anxiety episodes, the mornings when he'd cling to my hand and beg not to be left at school. She knew which parent had been showing up for conferences, for school events, for the countless small moments that actually mattered. That evening, Patricia called. Not Marcus, Patricia. "Isabella, dear." Her voice dripped with false concern. "I think it's time we had a conversation about what's best for Caleb." "What do you want, Patricia?" "I want what any grandmother wants, to see her grandchild happy and well-adjusted. This custody battle is going to be traumatic for him. Marcus is willing to be generous in the settlement if you'll agree to reasonable visitation terms." Reasonable. There was that word again. And what does Marcus consider reasonable? Primary custody with him, of course. You'd have every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. It's actually quite generous, considering the circumstances. I almost laughed at the audacity. The circumstances being that your son abandoned his family for a vacation house. Patricia's tone sharpened. The circumstances being that Caleb needs stability, structure, and a parent who won't coddle his every emotion. Marcus can provide that. He can give Caleb opportunities you simply can't afford. After I hung up, I found Caleb sitting at the kitchen island, pretending to work on homework, but clearly having overheard the conversation. His small shoulders were hunched, and he was gripping his pencil so tightly his knuckles were white. "Mom?" he said quietly. "Are you and Dad going to fight about me in front of other people?" My heart broke into 1,000 pieces. "Oh, sweetheart, no. Not fight about you. We're going to talk to some people about what's best for our family. But you're not something to fight over. You're the most precious thing in my world. But Dad said I might have to live in 2 different houses now, and that judge people decide things about kids they don't even know." I pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his strawberry shampoo. Sometimes adults need help making big decisions. That's what judges do. They listen to everyone and help figure out what's right. Will I have to talk to the judge? The question I'd been dreading. "Only if you want to, Caleb." Only if you have something you think the judge should know. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that made my blood run cold. What if Dad gets mad at me for telling the truth? That night, after Caleb was asleep, I sat in my home office surrounded by legal documents, character references, and financial statements. Rebecca had prepared me for every possible argument Marcus might make. But she hadn't prepared me for the way this battle was already changing my son. Caleb was walking on eggshells, just like I had been for years. He was learning to weigh his words, to worry about adult reactions to his honesty, to feel responsible for problems he hadn't created. Marcus was turning our custody battle into another form of emotional manipulation, and Caleb was caught in the crossfire. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Looking forward to seeing you in court. Tomorrow. May the best parent win. Even his courtroom threats had that same calculated charm I'd once found attractive. But now I could see it for what it really was. The polished veneer of a man who viewed relationships as competitions to be won, rather than bonds to be cherished. Friday morning would bring Judge Richard Blackwood's aggressive arguments, and the beginning of a legal battle that would determine my son's future. But as I sat there in the quiet house, I realized something important. Marcus thought he held all the cards. He had the money, the connections, the legal team, the social standing. What he didn't have was the truth. And sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, the truth has a way of speaking for itself. Especially when it comes from the mouth of an 8-year-old boy who'd been watching, listening, and remembering everything. Friday morning arrived with an unexpected twist that would change everything. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., my stomach churning with pre-court nerves, only to find a message from Rebecca's office on my voicemail. The temporary custody hearing had been postponed until the following Tuesday due to a scheduling conflict with Judge Richardson's calendar. Marcus's doing, no doubt. Richard Blackwood probably knew exactly which strings to pull to buy his client more time. 5 more days of uncertainty, 5 more days of psychological warfare. But as it turned out, those 5 days would give us something neither Marcus nor his expensive legal team could have anticipated. I spent Friday morning trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Caleb. We made French toast for breakfast, worked on his weekend reading assignment, and planned a trip to the Museum of the Natural History. He'd been asking to see the new dinosaur exhibit for weeks, and I thought the distraction would be good for both of us. Around noon, Caleb was upstairs in his room, supposedly organizing his rock collection, when I heard him call down in a voice that sounded strange, excited but confused. "Mom? Can you come up here?" Something weird happened with my tablet. I found him sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by his carefully labeled specimens of quartz and pyrite, holding his tablet with a puzzled expression. It started making notification sounds, but when I opened it, there were all these messages that aren't mine, he said, handing me the device. I think it got mixed up with Dad's phone somehow. My heart stopped. The tablet and Marcus's phone were linked through the same Apple ID, something we'd set up years ago so Caleb could access educational apps and approved games. In all the chaos of the separation, neither of us had thought to disconnect the accounts. The screen showed a series of text messages between Marcus and someone named Victoria Langston, timestamps from just hours earlier. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the conversation, each message more devastating than the last. "Can't wait for this custody nonsense to be over," Marcus had written. "The sooner I get minimal visitation locked in, the sooner I can focus on our future without all this family baggage." Victoria's response made my stomach lurch. "I don't understand why you're even fighting for partial custody. Didn't you say the kid is too much work? It's about image, babe. I can't be the father who abandoned his child completely. Bad for business. But once I get every other weekend, I can ship him off to my mother's house during my time. She's been dying to fix his emotional problems anyway. I felt like I was falling through the floor. But the messages kept coming, each one worse than the last. Besides, Marcus continued, Isabella has been poisoning him against me for years. All that therapy talk and emotional validation garbage. The kid needs some real discipline. A few months with Patricia will straighten him out. What if he doesn't want to come? Victoria asked. Kids don't get to choose. That's what court orders are for. He'll learn to deal with it, or he'll learn to stay quiet about it. Either way works for me. The final message in the thread, sent just 20 minutes earlier, made my hands shake so violently I almost dropped the tablet. Honestly, I'm hoping he'll just refuse to visit after a few times. Then I can tell everyone Isabella turned him against me, and I'll be off the hook completely. Win-win. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, trying to process the level of calculated cruelty they represented. This wasn't just about our marriage ending or even about Marcus wanting a new life. This was about him systematically planning to psychologically damage our son as a means to an end. Mom? Caleb's small voice broke through my shock. Are those messages about me? I looked down at my 8-year-old son, sitting among his treasured rock collection, his brown eyes wide with confusion and hurt. He'd read them. Of course he'd read them. The messages had appeared on his tablet, and he was too smart not to understand what they meant. Sweetheart? I started, but he interrupted me. Dad doesn't really want to see me, does he? His voice was matter of fact, but I could see the tears threatening to spill over. He just wants to look like a good dad to other people. I set the tablet aside and pulled him into my arms, feeling his small body tremble against mine. Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry you had to see that. None of this is your fault, and none of it is true about who you are. But it is true about what Dad thinks, he said quietly. He thinks I'm too much work. He thinks there's something wrong with me that Grandma Patricia needs to fix. My heart shattered completely. This beautiful, sensitive, intelligent child was internalizing his father's rejection as evidence of his own inadequacy. There is nothing wrong with you, Caleb. Nothing. You are perfect exactly as you are. We sat there on his bedroom floor for a long time, holding each other while I tried to find words to comfort him. But Caleb, in that way, children sometimes surprise you with their wisdom, was already processing the situation differently than I expected. Mom, he said finally, pulling back to look at me with suddenly determined eyes. The judge should know about these messages, shouldn't she? What do you mean, sweetheart? In court, when people are trying to decide what's best for kids. Shouldn't they know what parents really think? Not just what they say in front of other people? I studied his face, seeing a maturity there that no 8-year-old should have to develop. Do you want them to know? He nodded slowly. I don't want other kids to have to live with parents who don't really want them, and I don't want to have to pretend that Dad loves me when he doesn't. That afternoon, I called Rebecca and explained what had happened. She arrived at our house within an hour, her usual composed demeanor giving way to barely contained excitement when she saw the messages. This changes everything, she said, photographing each screen with her phone while carefully preserving the original metadata. These aren't just casual complaints about custody arrangements. This is documented proof of intentional emotional harm and manipulation. Can we use them in court? I asked. Not only can we use them, they might be the most powerful evidence we have. Direct statements about planning to psychologically damage a child, about using court orders as weapons, about deliberately creating situations designed to make Caleb reject his father. Rebecca looked up from the tablet. Marcus just handed us his entire strategy. But the most important moment came that evening, when Caleb and I were cleaning up after dinner. He was loading his plate into the dishwasher when he suddenly stopped and turned to me. Mom, when we go to court, can I show the judge the messages myself? You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with, sweetheart. I know, but I want to. I want to tell her what it feels like to read that your dad thinks you're too much trouble." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe if I tell the truth about how it made me feel, other kids won't have to feel that way." Looking at my son in that moment, this brave, compassionate child who wanted to protect other children even while processing his own pain, I knew that Marcus had made a fatal miscalculation. He'd counted on Caleb being too young, too scared, too damaged to speak up. He'd assumed that his money and connections and legal maneuvering would overwhelm a single mother and her anxious child. But he'd forgotten that truth has its own power. And sometimes, the most devastating truths come from the people who have the least reason to lie. Tuesday morning couldn't come fast enough, because now we had something Richard Blackwood's aggressive tactics couldn't counter, something Patricia's manipulation couldn't dismiss, something Marcus's charm couldn't explain away. We had his own words, spoken in private, revealing the cold calculation behind his public performance. And we had a little boy brave enough to make sure the world heard them. Tuesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavy and uncertain. I woke up before my alarm, my heart already racing with anticipation. Today was the day everything would finally come to light. Caleb was already awake when I went to check on him, sitting on the edge of his bed in his favorite navy blue button-down shirt and khaki pants. He'd insisted on dressing up for court, saying he wanted to look responsible and honest for the judge. His small hands were folded in his lap, and he was staring out his bedroom window at the rain. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" I asked, sitting beside him. "Nervous," he admitted, "but also ready, like when you have to get a shot at the doctor's office. You don't want to do it, but you know it'll help." The comparison broke my heart and filled me with pride at the same time. At 8 years old, my son understood something about courage that many adults never learn. Rebecca met us in the courthouse lobby at 8:30 a.m. The Riverside County Courthouse was an imposing granite building with marble floors that echoed every footstep. Security guards, attorneys in expensive suits, and families in various states of crisis filled the corridors. "Remember," Rebecca said quietly as we walked toward Judge Richardson's courtroom, "we're going to start with the standard custody arguments. Marcus's team will present their case first. Then we'll have our turn. Caleb, you won't speak until the very end, and only if you still want to." Caleb nodded solemnly, clutching a manila folder that contained printouts of the messages from his tablet. He'd insisted on carrying them himself. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Judge Richardson sat behind an imposing bench, a woman in her mid-50s, with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Marcus was already seated at the petitioner's table with Richard Blackwood, looking every inch the successful attorney in his charcoal pinstripe suit. Patricia sat directly behind him in the gallery, wearing a navy blazer and her trademark pearls, her face arranged in an expression of concerned grandmotherly worry. When Marcus saw us enter, he smiled and gave Caleb a small wave, as if they were meeting at a school function rather than a custody hearing. Caleb looked at his father for a long moment, then looked away without responding. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the Honorable Judge Richardson presiding. Judge Richardson reviewed the case files briefly, then looked up at both legal teams. "This is a temporary custody hearing in the matter of Thornfield versus Thornfield. Mr. Blackwood, you may present your client's position." Richard Blackwood stood, with practiced confidence, his silver hair perfectly styled, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd won countless similar battles. "Your Honor, my client, Marcus Thornfield, is requesting joint physical custody of his son, Caleb. Mr. Thornfield is a successful attorney and loving father who has always provided for his family's financial and emotional needs." For the next 20 minutes, Blackwood painted a picture of Marcus as the ideal father. Successful, stable, committed to his son's future. He presented Marcus's financial statements, his plans for Caleb's education, character references from his law firm colleagues. Mrs. Thornfield, while well-intentioned, has shown a pattern of overprotectiveness that has hindered Caleb's emotional development. Blackwood continued. My client believes that balanced custody will provide Caleb with the structure and guidance he needs to thrive. I watched Marcus throughout Blackwood's presentation. He sat perfectly still, occasionally nodding at particularly compelling points, playing the role of the concerned father to perfection. If I hadn't seen those text messages, I might have believed the performance myself. Then it was our turn. Rebecca stood and immediately shifted the tone of the proceedings. Your Honor, while Mr. Thornfield may appear to be a model father in this courtroom, we have evidence that tells a very different story about his true intentions regarding his son. She presented our evidence methodically. Documentation of Marcus's absence from school events, medical appointments, and therapy consultations. Character witnesses who testified about my consistent involvement in Caleb's life. Financial records showing that despite his substantial income, Marcus had contributed minimally to Caleb's daily care expenses. But I could see Judge Richardson's expression remained neutral, professional. This was all standard custody hearing material. The kind of he said, she said evidence that made family court such a difficult arena for justice. That's when Rebecca made her move. Your Honor, we have one more piece of evidence that we believe is crucial to this case. Last Friday, due to shared technology accounts, a series of text messages intended for Mr. Thornfield were accidentally delivered to his son's tablet. These messages reveal Mr. Thornfield's true feelings about custody and his plans for his son's future. Blackwood shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Any private communications obtained without consent were inadvertently received by the child himself, Rebecca interrupted smoothly. And with the court's permission, Caleb would like to address these messages directly. Judge Richardson raised an eyebrow and looked at Caleb, who had been sitting quietly beside me throughout the entire proceeding. Young man, do you have something you'd like to tell the court? Caleb stood up slowly, his manila folder clutched in his small hands. His voice was quiet but clear when he spoke. Yes, ma'am. I do. Come forward, please. I watched my 8-year-old son walk to the front of the courtroom with steady steps, despite the tremor I could see in his hands. He stopped in front of Judge Richardson's bench and looked up at her with those earnest brown eyes. Your Honor, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I got some messages on my tablet that were meant for my dad. I think you should know what they say, because they're about me. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting to see what would happen next. Caleb opened his folder and pulled out the printed messages. My dad wrote to his girlfriend that he doesn't really want to spend time with me. He said I'm too much work, and that he only wants custody because it's bad for business if people think he abandoned me. Marcus had gone completely pale. Blackwood was frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how to object to an 8-year-old reading his own father's words. But Caleb wasn't finished. He looked directly at his father for the first time since entering the courtroom. He also said he wants to send me to Grandma Patricia's house during his time because she can fix my emotional problems, and that he hopes I'll just stop wanting to visit him so he can blame Mom and be off the hook completely. Judge Richardson's expression had shifted from neutral professionalism to something much sharper. Are these your father's exact words, Caleb? Yes, ma'am. I can read them to you if you want. They're right here. He held up the papers with steady hands. That won't be necessary. Do you understand what these messages mean? Caleb nodded. They mean my dad doesn't really love me. He just wants to look like he does so other people won't think he's a bad person. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I could see Patricia shrinking in her seat, her composed facade cracking. Marcus sat frozen, staring at his son like he couldn't believe this was happening. Caleb, Judge Richardson said gently, how do these messages make you feel? Sad, he said simply. But also, relieved? Because now I know it's not my fault that he doesn't want to spend time with me. I thought maybe if I was better at sports or didn't cry so much, he'd love me more. But these messages show that he decided I was too much trouble no matter what I did. Judge Richardson leaned back in her chair, studying the small boy standing before her bench with remarkable composure. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the court, Caleb? Yes, ma'am. I don't want to live with someone who thinks I'm a problem to be solved. I want to live with my mom, who thinks I'm perfect just the way I am. And I don't think other kids should have to pretend their parents love them when they don't. With that, Caleb walked back to our table and sat down beside me, sliding his small hand into mine. Judge Richardson looked at Marcus with an expression that could have frozen fire. Mr. Thornfield, do you have any response to your son's testimony? Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, his silver tongue had failed him completely. Because how do you explain to a judge that you never meant for your son to know you didn't want him? The silence in courtroom 4B stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Marcus sat frozen at his table, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to form words that simply wouldn't come. The man who had built his career on persuasive arguments, who could convince juries and negotiate million-dollar deals, was utterly speechless in the face of his 8-year-old son's devastating honesty. Richard Blackwood was frantically shuffling through papers, clearly searching for some legal precedent that could salvage his client's case. But what precedent exists for a father being exposed by his own cruel words, delivered accidentally to the very child he'd been discussing like a business liability? Judge Richardson set down her pen and folded her hands on the bench. Her expression had transformed from professional neutrality to something much more pointed. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too many children damaged by adults who should have protected them. Mr. Blackwood, she said, does your client wish to respond to these allegations? Blackwood stood quickly, his usual confidence replaced by visible panic. Your Honor, these private communications were taken out of context. My client was simply expressing frustration during a difficult time. Expressing frustration? Judge Richardson's voice sharpened. Mr. Blackwood, I've been presiding over family court for 15 years. I've heard every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to minimize harmful behavior toward children. What I just heard from this child's own testimony was not frustration. It was calculated emotional manipulation. She turned her attention directly to Marcus. Mr. Thornfield, please stand. Marcus rose slowly, his face ashen. The confident attorney who had walked into this courtroom 2 hours ago had vanished, replaced by a man who suddenly looked much smaller. In my years on this bench, Judge Richardson continued, I have rarely encountered such clear evidence of a parent's true intentions regarding their child. Your son just testified that you described him as too much work, that you plan to use court-ordered visitation as a weapon to psychologically manipulate him, and that you hope he will eventually reject you so you can blame his mother and abandon your parental responsibilities entirely. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Your Honor, those messages were private. Those messages were about a child, Mr. Thornfield. A child who accidentally received them and had to confront the devastating reality that his father views him as a burden rather than a blessing. Judge Richardson's tone was ice cold. A child who had the courage to stand in this courtroom and speak that truth, despite the pain it clearly caused him. I felt Caleb's hand tighten in mine. He was sitting perfectly still, watching the proceedings with the same serious concentration he brought to his science projects. But I could feel the slight tremor in his small fingers, the weight of having to grow up so fast, so publicly. Judge Richardson continued addressing Marcus. Furthermore, your plan to delegate your court-ordered time to your mother, specifically to fix his emotional problems, shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what parenting requires. This court's responsibility is to protect children, not to facilitate their continued emotional harm. Richard Blackwood made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, surely my client deserves the opportunity to address these concerns, to demonstrate his commitment to change. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Richardson interrupted. Your client had 8 years to demonstrate his commitment to his son. Instead, according to the evidence presented today, he has spent those years viewing the child as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be loved. She opened the file in front of her and began writing. The scratching of her pen against paper was the only sound in the courtroom for several long moments. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, she announced, including the testimony of the minor child, this court finds that joint custody would not be in Caleb Thornfield's best interests. My heart stopped. This was it, the moment that would determine my son's future. I am awarding primary physical and legal custody to Isabella Thornfield, effective immediately. Judge Richardson's voice rang clear through the courtroom. Mr. Thornfield will be granted supervised visitation only, pending completion of a court-mandated psychological evaluation and parenting classes. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. Caleb squeezed my hand tighter, and when I looked down at him, I saw the smallest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But Judge Richardson wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, given the concerning nature of Mr. Thornfield's communications about using his mother as a surrogate parent during his custodial time, I am ordering that any future visitation must be directly supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Under no circumstances is the child to be left in the care of Patricia Thornfield without professional oversight. Patricia gasped audibly from the gallery. Her carefully composed facade finally cracked completely, and she stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is outrageous," she called out. "That woman has poisoned my grandson against his own family." "Ma'am," Judge Richardson's voice cut through Patricia's outburst like a blade. "You will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed from my courtroom. Your grandson has not been poisoned against anyone. He has simply been honest about his experiences." Patricia sat down heavily, her pearls clicking against each other as her hands shook with rage. Judge Richardson turned her attention back to the case at hand. "Additionally, I am ordering that Mr. Thornfield begin therapy with a licensed family counselor before any visitation can commence. The court wants to see evidence of genuine change, not simply compliance with legal requirements." Marcus was still standing, but he looked like he might collapse at any moment. The reality of what had just happened was clearly sinking in. His careful plan to maintain appearances while minimizing his actual parental responsibilities had backfired spectacularly. "Mr. Thornfield," Judge Richardson addressed him directly, "your son showed remarkable courage today. He chose to tell the truth even when it was painful, even when it exposed him to potential retaliation from the adults in his life. I suggest you take time to reflect on what kind of man you want to be. The kind who sees such courage as a threat to be managed, or the kind who recognizes it as something to be admired." She closed the file with finality. "This court is adjourned. Mrs. Thornfield, please remain available for the clerk to provide you with copies of today's custody order." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly buzzing courtroom. I looked down at Caleb, who was staring up at me with wide eyes. "Does this mean I get to stay with you?" he whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered back, pulling him close. "You get to stay with me." He buried his face against my shoulder, and I felt his small body shake with what I realized were tears of relief. For weeks, he'd been carrying the weight of uncertainty, wondering if he'd be forced to live with a father who saw him as a problem to be solved. Across the courtroom, Marcus was having what appeared to be a heated conversation with Richard Blackwood. I could see Blackwood shaking his head, probably explaining why an appeal would be pointless given the strength of Caleb's testimony and the documented evidence. Patricia had already stormed out, her exit marked by the sharp clicking of her heels against the marble floors. I suspected we wouldn't be hearing from her for quite some time. Rebecca gathered her papers with barely contained satisfaction. "Isabella," she said quietly, "in 20 years of family law, I've never seen a case turn so completely on a child's testimony. Caleb was extraordinary today." As we prepared to leave the courtroom, Caleb tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, can we get ice cream now? I feel like celebrating." I laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks. "Absolutely. What flavor?" "All of them," he said with a grin that reminded me of the happy little boy he'd been before this nightmare began. "I want to try all of them." Walking out of that courthouse, with my son's hand in mine and the custody papers secure in Rebecca's briefcase, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just hope for our immediate future, but hope that justice could actually prevail when truth was given a voice. Caleb had found his voice that day, and in doing so, he'd saved us both. 6 months later, I'm sitting in our new kitchen in Riverside Gardens, watching Caleb help his friend Emma from school build a volcano for their joint science project. The afternoon sunlight streams through windows that actually open properly, unlike our old house where Marcus had insisted on expensive automated systems that constantly malfunctioned. This house is smaller, simpler, but it's ours in a way our Maplewood Heights mansion never was. We picked it together. Caleb loved the reading nook in the living room and the fact that his bedroom window faces the community garden where he can watch the neighbor kids walking their dogs. "Mom, do you think we added too much baking soda?" Caleb calls out, his face streaked with red food coloring from their volcanic lava. "There's no such thing as too much when it comes to science experiments," I tell him, and he grins before turning back to Emma, who's carefully documenting their measurements in a notebook. It's these ordinary moments that feel most extraordinary. Now, the sound of children laughing in my kitchen, the chaos of school projects spread across our dining table, the complete absence of tension that used to permeate every corner of our previous life. Caleb has bloomed in ways I didn't even realize he'd been withering before. His anxiety attacks stopped completely about 3 months ago. He sleeps through the night in his own room, no longer afraid of the dark or convinced that something terrible will happen while he's asleep. His teacher, Mrs. Foster, says he's become one of the most confident speakers in his class, a far cry from the quiet, withdrawn child who used to dread show and tell. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Those first few weeks after the custody hearing were challenging in unexpected ways. Caleb had nightmares about having to go live with his father anyway, convinced that somehow the judge would change her mind. He'd wake up in tears, asking if we needed to pack his suitcase for Patricia's house. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the child psychologist Rebecca had recommended, helped us both process what had happened. She explained to Caleb that speaking truth about difficult things is one of the bravest acts anyone can perform, but that it also takes time to heal from the hurt that made that truth necessary. "Your dad's words about you weren't true," she told him during one of their sessions that I was invited to observe. "But the fact that he said them was real, and it makes sense that it hurt you. We don't have to pretend it didn't happen, but we also don't have to let it define how you see yourself." Marcus never did complete those court-mandated parenting classes. After 2 sessions, his supervised visitation requests stopped altogether. Rebecca heard through the legal community that he'd moved to Seattle with Victoria, starting fresh in a new city where no one knew about the custody case that had exposed him so completely. Part of me expected to feel angry about his abandonment, but mostly I felt relieved. Caleb deserved better than a father who showed up out of obligation or image management. He deserved to be surrounded by people who chose to love him, not people who saw him as a burden to be endured. Patricia made one attempt to maintain contact, sending a letter 3 months after the hearing requesting grandmother's rights to see Caleb. The letter was full of her typical manipulative language about how I was depriving her grandson of family connections, and how Caleb needed strong male influence in his life. Caleb read the letter. I've learned to be completely transparent with him about adult situations that affect him, and his response was both heartbreaking and empowering. Grandma Patricia thinks I need different people in my life to be okay, he said thoughtfully. But I like who I am now. I don't want to go back to feeling like I'm doing everything wrong. I framed that letter from Patricia and hung it in my home office as a reminder. Not because I agreed with it, but because it represents everything we've moved away from. The idea that children need to be fixed, that love comes with conditions, that speaking truth is somehow disrespectful or damaging. Our new life isn't perfect, but it's authentic. Money is tighter now without Marcus's attorney salary, but we've found creative ways to have fun that don't require expensive restaurants or elaborate vacations. We explore local hiking trails, have movie nights with homemade popcorn, and Caleb has discovered a passion for cooking that has us trying new recipes every weekend. I've rebuilt my interior design business, Bella Interiors, focusing on helping families create spaces that actually feel like home rather than showpieces for impressing others. My client base is smaller but more meaningful. People who want their houses to reflect their values rather than their bank accounts. Sarah Chen and her daughter Emma have become our chosen family. Sarah and I started a support group for single mothers that meets twice a month at the community center. We call it Truth Tellers, and it's become a safe space for women to share their real experiences without judgment or pressure to minimize their struggles. Caleb often plays with the other children while we meet, and I've watched him become a natural leader among them. He's the one who notices when someone feels left out, who suggests including the quiet kids in games, who stands up when older children try to bully the younger ones. I know what it feels like when grown-ups don't believe you, he told me after, defending a 6-year-old who was being teased about his stutter. So I try to believe all the kids, even when what they're saying sounds weird. That wisdom from an 8-year-old, now 9, continues to astound me. He understands something about justice and compassion that many adults never learn. The legal resolution was just the beginning of our healing journey. The real transformation has been watching Caleb rediscover his own voice and learning to trust that speaking his truth is not only safe, but powerful. He still keeps those text message printouts in a special folder in his desk drawer. Not because he wants to relive the pain they caused, but because they remind him that he was brave enough to show them to a judge when it mattered. Sometimes kids need to see that other kids can be brave, he explained when I asked why he'd kept them. Maybe if someone else is scared to tell the truth about their family, they'll remember that I did it and it worked out okay. That folder has become something of a symbol in our house, evidence that truth, even when it's difficult, has the power to set things right. If this story has moved you in any way, I want you to know that you're not alone. Whether you're a parent fighting for your child's well-being, a child who feels unheard in your own family, or someone who's ever been made to feel like your emotions are too much, your voice matters. The system isn't perfect, and justice doesn't always prevail the way it did for us. But speaking truth still has power, especially when we speak it together, when we believe children who find the courage to share difficult realities, and when we refuse to accept that love should ever come with conditions. Caleb taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right even when your hands are shaking. He was 9 years old when he stood up in that courtroom, but his bravery changed both our lives forever. If you've found strength in our story, please share it. Like this video, leave a comment about your own experience, or simply pass it along to someone who might need to hear that their truth matters too. And remember, when someone shows you who they really are through their actions and their private words, believe them. But also remember that you have the power to choose who gets to stay in your life and who deserves to witness your growth. Caleb and I chose each other, and that choice has made all the difference. 2 years after Judge Richardson's ruling, on a crisp October morning, everything changed again. I was in my home office reviewing design proposals for a family whose teenage daughter had requested a safe space bedroom after experiencing bullying at school when the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a black sedan parked in our driveway. Expensive, unfamiliar, with tinted windows that made my stomach clench with old anxiety. Caleb was at his Saturday morning coding class at the Riverside Community Center, so I was alone when I opened the door to find Marcus standing on my front porch. He looked older, grayer around the temples, wearing a wool coat I didn't recognize and an expression I'd never seen before. Not the confident smirk or cold calculation I remembered, but something that looked almost like shame. "Hello, Isabella," he said quietly. I know I should have called first. My first instinct was to slam the door, to call Rebecca, to protect the peaceful life Caleb and I had built. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes, made me pause. "What do you want, Marcus?" "I want to apologize," he said simply. "To both of you, but especially to Caleb." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation, for the practiced charm that had fooled me for so many years. But this felt different. Broken, somehow. Why now? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I remembered from our early days together when he was genuinely nervous about something. "Victoria left me 6 months ago. She said—" He paused, struggling with the words. "She said she finally understood what kind of man I really was when she saw how easily I walked away from my own son." I didn't invite him in, but I stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind me. Whatever this conversation was going to be, it needed to happen away from our sanctuary. "I've been in therapy," Marcus continued, his voice barely above, a whisper. "Real therapy, not the court-mandated sessions I skipped. Dr. Patricia Morales in Seattle, she specializes in people like me. People who use control and manipulation instead of love." The irony of his therapist's name, the same as his mother's, wasn't lost on me. "Marcus, I don't know what you're hoping to accomplish here." "I'm not hoping to accomplish anything," he interrupted, then caught himself. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to interrupt you. I know I have no right to be here. No right to ask for anything. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I did to him. What I did to both of you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Dr. Morales helped me write this. It's a letter for Caleb. I don't expect you to give it to him if you don't think it's appropriate. But I needed to try to tell him that none of what happened was his fault." I took the letter, but didn't unfold it. "Marcus, Caleb knows it wasn't his fault. We've worked very hard to make sure he understands that." "I know. I know you have. And that's—" His voice cracked slightly. "That's what makes this so much worse. You protected him from the damage I was trying to cause. You both protected each other." A car drove by, and Marcus flinched slightly, as if he was afraid someone might see him here. The confident attorney who had once commanded every room he entered seemed to have vanished entirely. "The things I said about him in those text messages," he continued, "they haunt me now. Because I know what an extraordinary child he is. I always knew it, even then. I resented it. I resented that he was everything I could never be. Brave, honest, emotionally intelligent. I saw his sensitivity as weakness because I was too much of a coward to feel anything real myself. I found myself thinking about Caleb, probably sitting in that computer lab right now, helping younger kids debug their code with infinite patience, the way he did everything, with kindness and genuine care for others. He testified in court. "That day," I said quietly, "not because he wanted to hurt you, but because he wanted to protect other children from feeling the way you made him feel." Marcus closed his eyes. "I know. I've read the transcript. Dr. Morales made me read it as part of my treatment. He opened his eyes and looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. He was 9 years old, and he was braver than I've ever been in my entire life. He still is. I'm sure he is. Marcus stepped back toward his car. I'm not asking to see him, Isabella. I know I forfeited that right. I'm not asking for anything except maybe someday, if he ever wants to know that his father finally understood what he threw away, you could tell him that. He paused at his car door. I'm moving back to Chicago. My mother, Patricia, has been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She needs care, and it seems fitting that I'm the one who has to provide it, given how much damage we caused together. The poetic justice of that arrangement wasn't lost on me either. Marcus, I called out as he opened his car door. That letter, what does it say? It says, I'm sorry. It says he was never the problem. I was. And it says that watching him stand up for himself and speak his truth was the most proud I've ever been of anyone in my life, even though I was too broken to realize it at the time. After he drove away, I sat on our front porch for a long time, holding the letter and thinking about forgiveness, redemption, and the complexity of human nature. Part of me wanted to tear up the letter without reading it, to protect our peaceful life from any reminder of the pain Marcus had caused. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust my son's wisdom, knew that Caleb should be the one to decide whether his father's apology mattered to him. When Caleb came home that afternoon, full of excitement about the program he'd helped create, I showed him the letter. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, wariness, curiosity. What does it say? He asked. I don't know. I thought you should be the first to read it if you want to. He held the envelope for a moment, then set it on the kitchen counter. Can I think about it for a while? Of course. It's completely your choice. 3 days later, Caleb decided to read the letter. I sat beside him on our living room couch as he unfolded the paper, ready to comfort him if the contents proved hurtful. But as he read, his expressions softened rather than hardened. Mom, he said finally, I think Dad might finally understand what you tried to teach me about apologizing. What's that? That saying sorry isn't about making the person who got hurt feel better about what happened to them. It's about taking responsibility for what you did wrong and promising to do better, even if the person you hurt doesn't forgive you. At 11 years old, Caleb had articulated something about accountability that many adults never grasp. Do you want to respond? To him? I asked carefully. Caleb folded the letter and handed it back to me. Not yet. Maybe someday. But I'm glad he wrote it. It helps me know that when I was brave in that courtroom, it actually changed something important. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not just that we had won our freedom from Marcus's manipulation, but that Caleb's courage had rippled outward in ways we never could have imagined. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply tell the truth and trust that it will find its way to the people who need to hear it. Even when those people are the ones who hurt you in the first place, even when they're your own father, finally learning what love actually means. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.